Good afternoon, all. We are on chapter 89 of A Child's History of the World. The chapter is titled A New Big Power in the World. After World War II and all its killing and destruction, only two really strong countries were left in the world. These were both very big countries.
Hey, Mom, I don't hear Odie or Caleb or Percy.
So, it's okay.
It's weird.
It means they're being quiet and being good. One of the reasons these two countries were strong is that they were so big. On all that land, they had lots of resources a country needs to make it strong. Land to grow food, lots of water, wood to build things, and minerals like iron, coal, and oil. These all help make a country strong. Have you guessed which two big countries I'm talking about? One is very easy to guess. What are the countries? And?
Russia.
And Russia. During World War II, you remember these two giants were friends. They were allies. They fought on the same side. After the war was over, they became rivals. They competed to see which would be the strongest. This made a lot of trouble in the world. Let me tell you what had been happening in Russia since you last read about that country. Peter the Great was a ruler of Russia called a Tsar, or emperor. Russia was ruled by a Tsar, or a Tsarina, as a Russian queen was called, for almost 200 years after Peter the Great. Then the Russians had a big bloody revolution. This began in 1917. The Tsar, who was ruling, and all of his family were shot. The reason for the Russian Revolution was about the same as for the French Revolution. The Tsar and his nobles had great riches and power, but most people were very poor, and they had no hope of life ever getting better for them. In 1917, Russia had been fighting in World War I for 3 hard years. The war had made the misery of the people even more hopeless. When the revolution started, the soldiers stopped fighting and came home to help overthrow the ruler. A Russian named Lenin had been working and plotting for many years. I asked you to stop. If I have to address it again, you'll be standing in timeout while I read. Do you understand? Yes or no? Soon, Lenin was the head of the revolutionary government and the ruler of Russia. In 1922, after the revolution, Russia was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, shortened to USSR, the Soviet Union, or the Soviets. The USSR included not only Russia, but eventually 14 other republics in Europe and in Asia that had been conquered by Russia. Lenin believed in a kind of government called communism. In communism, everything was supposed to belong to the state for the good of all the poor people. Most of the big farms, for instance, were taken away from the rich owners and made into collective farms. A collective farm is a large farm where everybody works together to raise the crops, and the profit goes partly to all the people on the collective farm. All the factories and stores in a communist country are owned not by private people as they are in our country, but by the state. The communist state itself is supposed to be owned by all the people together. This was a great change from the rule of the czars, where most of the wealth and power was in the hands of the Tsar and his nobles. The communists felt they had to be sure that the new government would work, so they gave a great deal of power to the head of the Communist Party, and he became as powerful as a dictator. What do you need? Oh, okay. After the revolution, there was much suffering at first. Many people even starved to death, and many who were not in favor of communism were shot. But more and more schools were built, and this was good, for few people had been able to go to school when the Tsar had ruled. The poor people were still poor, but they felt now that there was a great difference from being poor under the Tsar with no hope of life ever becoming better for them. Now there was hope of better things to come. Great dams were built across the rivers to supply electricity for steel plants and tractor factories. The nobles' palaces were turned into museums for the people. Subways were built in Moscow. The army was given good leaders and was well trained. The communists did two things that worried other countries a great deal. They made religious practices unlawful so that all houses of worship were closed. And they believed that communism should be spread all over the world. Even in countries where the people were not ill-treated and were satisfied with their own kind of government, the communists hoped to get revolutions going so that communism could be made the form of government everywhere. When Lenin died, the man who took his place as the ruler of the Soviet Union had a long name which would be very hard for you or me to pronounce because we're not used to the Russian language. But luckily, he was called by his nickname, Stalin, which is quite easy and means man of steel. Stalin had first studied as a young man to be a priest, but then instead of becoming a priest, he had become a communist. It was, of course, very dangerous to be a communist under the Tsar's government, and Stalin had been put in prison and had often had to hide from the Tsar's men for trying to stir up a revolution. His experiences had made him hard and tough, and that's why his nickname was Stalin, man of steel. Stalin, hard as steel. Excuse me. Under Stalin, the Soviets built more factories and new, larger cities. When Germany suddenly attacked the USSR in World War II, the Soviet army under Stalin fought desperately against the Germans. Finally, as you know, the Soviet army drove the Germans out of the Soviet Union and entered Germany from the Soviet Union, while the Americans and British were coming in from France. After World War II, other countries found it hard to get along with the USSR because the Soviets had ideas about government and freedom so very different from the ideas of democracy, like the United States and England.
The USSR
is Russia. Soviet Union.
Mom, I was telling them. Because what if they don't know what USSR is?
I know. The Soviet Union was run by a dictator. People were not allowed to do or say what they wanted, but only what the government let them. The newspaper in the USSR were never free to print what they wanted to print, but only what the government told them to print. Visitors from other countries were not welcome in the USSR, and very few Soviets were allowed to visit other countries. The big country in Europe and the biggest country in Asia and the biggest country in the whole world had now become also one of the most important and powerful countries in the whole world. It also became the most dangerous country in the world. I'll tell you why in the next chapter. Well, everybody, ta-ta for now.